Thank you very much indeed. To put the case for Lithuania, if that's not overstating it a little, we have Lowry Wyman, who is a colleague of mine at the Russian Research Center. By profession, she is a lawyer. Her involvement in Lithuania came about because she was invited by Sąjūdis and by the new government in Lithuania to go to Lithuania and consult on legal issues. She is also a member of the Lawrence Tribe Group, which is advising the Lithuanian government on the political changes. I'd like to introduce Laurie Lyman.
It's a great privilege to be able to address you today. I apologize, I do have a bit of a cold, and if I stop and cough or blow my nose, I hope you won't mind. It was very exciting to be able to be in Lithuania when it proclaimed the restoration of independent statehood. And in order to give you the flavor of the moment, I wish to read the Act on the Restoration of the Lithuanian State. It's been mentioned in the press as the Declaration of Independence. I don't think that's entirely correct, and I also didn't see it published in the Western press in full. Supreme Council of the Republic of Lithuania, Act on the Restoration of the Lithuanian State. The Supreme Council of the Republic of Lithuania, expressing the will of the nation, resolves and solemnly proclaims that the execution of the sovereign power of the Lithuanian state, heretofore constrained by alien forces in 1940, is restored, and henceforth Lithuania is once again an independent state. The February 16, 1918 Act of Independence of the Supreme Council of Lithuania and the May 15, 1920 Constituent Assembly Resolution on the restoration of a democratic Lithuanian state have never lost their legal force and are the constitutional foundation of the Lithuanian state. The territory of Lithuania is integral and indivisible, and the constitution of any other state has no jurisdiction within it. The Lithuanian state emphasizes its adherence to universally recognized principles of international law, recognizes the principle of the inviolability of borders as formulated in Helsinki in 1975 in the final act of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and guarantees the rights of individuals, citizens, and ethnic communities. The Supreme Council of the Republic of Lithuania, expressing sovereign power by this act, begins to achieve the state's full sovereignty. And it was signed by Vytautas Landsbergis, the chairman of the Supreme Council of the Republic of Lithuania, who has been called the President of the Independent Republic of Lithuania. When I returned from the Soviet Union at the end of March, I went to Moscow from Vilnius on March 21st. I was shocked to read in the press the number of statements about secession from the Union and about heeding the voice of reason, Gorbachev's voice of reason. And I would also like to read something else, just so that once and for all, the actual history of the annexation of Lithuania by the USSR is clear, and what the legal bases are for Lithuania declaring that under international law it is an independent state. On March 22nd, President Landsbergis wrote to Gorbachev, "The annexation of Lithuania by the USSR violated the terms of Lenin's Declaration of Rights of the Peoples of Russia of November 15, 1917, the Soviet-Lithuanian Peace Treaty of July 12, 1920, the Lithuanian-Soviet Treaty of Non-Aggression of September 28, 1926, the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1929, the Lithuanian-Soviet Mutual Assistance Pact of October 10, 1939, and the Covenant of the League of Nations." So there are a number of violations here that are never mentioned. In light of the fact that Lithuania had come under Soviet occupation by June 1940, all subsequent actions of Soviet authorities in Lithuania designed to subvert and destroy the nation's sovereignty were void ab initio, including all such actions instituted by the government of Joseph Stalin. And you know about that. The government of the Republic of Lithuania also wishes to remind the Supreme Soviet of the USSR that the USSR government declared in its 1920 peace treaty with Lithuania that it recognized without reservation and for all time the sovereign rights and independence of the Lithuanian state. Lithuania has never formed, juridically speaking, part of the territory of the USSR, and that there is no legal justification for the validity of the 1977 USSR Constitution or other Soviet laws with respect to Lithuanian territory. Now, just for the sake of argument, I'd like to refer to the kinds of things that are said in the Soviet press, because I've seen them in the Western press. In Izvestia on March 28th, there was an article, actually it was in the form of an interview, and the caption of the article is called The Road to Independence, the Lithuanian situation in the mirror of international law. And the first question that's asked is, why does Lithuania insist that it's an independent nation without regard to the law of secession? And why is that wrong? And the answer to the interview is, well, I don't know. Lithuania must leave the Union because it's a member of the Soviet Union. Because there was a marriage between Lithuania and the Soviet Union. Even though maybe it wasn't a legal marriage, but according to international principles, when you have a divorce, you still have to resolve the questions of property. When you have a separation between people. I guess this is a palimony argument. Then he goes on to say that according to international principles, before you can declare independence, you have to work out all the legal details. And one of the phrases that's used in this is legal succession, legal все вопросы правопреемства, legal succession. So unless you have all the details worked out, you can't do anything. In that connection, one of the things that Soviets do, and this gentleman does, is to refer to precedent in Western nations. So he refers to Italy and France and other Western European countries and says, well, this is quite a phenomenon. And in the constitutions of Western European countries, they don't provide for secession. But we provide for secession in our constitution. Therefore, we provide for a right that doesn't exist in the developed Western European countries, and therefore we're much better than Western Europe. We're further advanced. He mentions, when he refers to the question of legal succession and continuity, that this is based on an English scholar who I don't know whether he's alive or dead, but I wouldn't want to be referred to in this article. He also mentions more than once that what the Lithuanians are doing is not what is done in the civilized world. He says, you ask me how these questions are decided in the civilized world, and I will tell you how they are decided in the civilized world. And I would like to bring to your attention, just in case you didn't happen to watch McNeil-Lehrer last night, that we had a Soviet legal scholar explain that Lithuania was attempting to blackmail the Soviet Union because it was pressuring the Soviet Union to make a decision with respect to its future, and that if the decision were not made properly, perhaps there'd be some consequences for the summit. So Lithuania was engaged in blackmail, and that was not civilized. And Mr. Lazaraitis, who was sitting at the same table with this gentleman, said, well, is it civilized to bring tanks in and to threaten people and to remove soldiers by force from psychiatric hospitals? And is it civilized to take over buildings and to literally put the fear of God into ordinary human beings? When all we have said is that we are happy to negotiate on any point except rescinding the Declaration of Independence, which, by the way, no country has ever done. Another thing that this gentleman mentions in the article is that, of course, you need to have a referendum, that it's not done in other parts of the world in a civilized fashion if you don't have a referendum, that you must have something on the order of a referendum or a plebiscite. We call it a referendum in the Soviet Union. And by the way, if such a referendum were conducted, we would have to conduct the census in Lithuania completely differently, because Lithuania violates international norms in conducting the census. It's just shameful, and so on. Then it's mentioned, because of the concern about returning territory and so forth, that of course there would be a question of returning the Vilnius Krai, or Klaipėda, which is a town on the sea, and then possibly some other territories to the Republic of Belarus, and that perhaps these territories would prefer to be part of the Union. And in the Soviet Union, we don't make decisions unless we take everyone's interests into account. And Lithuania is not taking the interests of everyone into account. Yesterday, I was at a forum at which two people spoke, and the speaker read a statement by Josef Brodsky, a Nobel laureate who has lived in this country for a long time and who speaks English more beautifully than I could ever hope to speak English. And he expressed his attitude towards the Americans' position, that is the administration's position with respect to Lithuania, as thoroughly disgusting. And I have to tell you that that's how I look at it also. I want to give you some more background into Soviet law, aside from the kind of legal argumentation that is in the Soviet press about international norms, without reference to any treaties that were ever concluded or any specific international norms that were ever violated, or perhaps any questions that should be properly resolved in an international forum. The Soviet Constitution, in my understanding of constitutions, is not a constitution at all. It's a declaration of political attitudes or rights. The person attempting to refer to it or rely upon it is told that the Constitution is not self-executing, that you need another law to somehow effectuate the provisions of the Constitution. And I need only remind you that this is the case in the provision, Article 72, with respect to the right to secede. Article 72 guarantees the right to secede, but someone noted that you don't have a mechanism to fulfill that right. So there needs to be a law to somehow fulfill that right. Therefore, the right in the Constitution means nothing at all. Well, I'd like to tell you what has been done to fulfill the right to secede in the law that was passed on April 3rd by the two chambers of the Supreme Soviet. Unfortunately, I've not yet seen the Russian version of the law. I'm relying on Radio Liberty reports on the contents, because as far as I know, it's not yet been published in the Soviet newspapers. This is what the law on secession provides, that 2/3 of the citizens of the USSR permanently resident in the republic in question, that is, not the citizens of the republic as defined by the republic itself, are supposed to vote in a referendum. But in such a case, this republic could lose, I'm sorry, I'm speaking too close to the microphone. The republic could lose any autonomous territories that did not belong to this republic at the time it became a part of the Soviet Union, and possibly also districts inhabited predominantly by members of nationalities other than the titular nationality of the republic. After the referendum has been concluded, and for the process to begin, it must be 2/3, as I mentioned. There's a period of 5 years in which presumably the basic questions, financial matters, territorial matters, economic matters, are resolved between all of the parties. It doesn't say what happens if they're somehow not resolved, but let's assume for the moment that something is resolved. Then, once this is done, the result is presented to the Congress of People's Deputies to come to a final decision as to what to do, so that even at that point, the Congress of People's Deputies can decide to reject the request, now I say, request for permission to secede. During that 5-year period, it's possible for anyone to raise, again, the question of secession. You only need 10% of the Republic to raise this question, to put the whole question again. If there's a vote on secession and it doesn't go through after this 5-year period, you can raise it one more time, but only after a second interval of 10 years. I think you can see why people in Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia and all the other republics think that this is a law against secession and not for secession. In addition, there have been statements that to support the Baltics in their efforts to assert independent statehood is somehow to undermine Gorbachev's position and undermine the very salutary processes that are underway in the Soviet Union. I want to bring your attention to a couple of other laws that were recently passed that I didn't see mentioned in the Western press. There was a law that was passed on April 5th that's called the Law on Strengthening Responsibility for Infringements of the Equal Rights of Nationalities and the Violent Breach of the Unity of the Territory of the USSR. I think you can expect what's in this law. It provides for criminal penalties for anyone who is going to attempt to change the territory of the USSR, so that anyone who is in the current Supreme Council of Lithuania would be subject to criminal penalties under this law. In addition, I should mention to you, it's sort of interesting that this was not mentioned in the Western press at all, because last year, when Gorbachev attempted to change what was the basis of Article 70 of the Criminal Code of the RSFSR into something much more unpleasant, that is, anyone calling for the overthrow of the government and using Xerox machines to spread the appeals to overthrow the government or change the social structure of the Soviet Union. This decree caused quite a furor in the West, and there was such an outcry of protest that eventually it was changed to provide for only violent calls for violent overthrow of the government. This particular article that I just referred to is a revision of that same article, and for some reason it just passed notice altogether. At the same time, 3 minutes, all right. At the same time, in addition to the presidency, which I'm sure you've read about in the Western press, which permits the president to do anything he wants by decree, there is also a new law that was passed on declaring an emergency situation in the country. And I would like to draw your attention to the fact that this was passed on April 9th, and the president is able to, under this law, to declare a state of national emergency and to take a whole variety of measures, including some pretty extraordinary things. One of the things that I enjoyed was insisting on the forced labor of citizens, if that was necessary, preventing the use of all kinds of Xerox machines or radios or televisions, if that's necessary, to overturn any order of the local government that's taken if he doesn't like it, to punish by criminal means anyone who spreads rumors. It's hard to say whether they really would have any effect on public order because of how Soviet law is generally interpreted. But anyway, what I wish to say is that the image that Gorbachev currently has of being a person who's advancing democratization and liberal attitudes, I don't think is borne out by these statutes that were passed in the wake of his accession to the presidency. I might add, with respect to his respect for the rule of law, he was voted in as president. I witnessed the voting in violation of the very procedures by which the presidency was voted on. And someone mentioned that to him, and he shouted that person down in the room. So he's not legally, even presently, the head of state. My time is up. I want to just say that I think that anything that is done in support of the genuine process of democratic reform and genuine Western principles of freedom and liberty that are being advanced in the Baltics should be supported by the United States. And I hope that anyone who is in this room will send a letter to President Bush to ask him to do that, because I don't see any reason to delay. Things are only going to get worse in the Soviet Union, and believe me, there are many people in the other republics who are hoping for that support so that they can further their own cause for freedom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. While people are moving down to the microphones, we have one here and one over here. I'd like to express our appreciation to Tom Teal, the Associate Editor of the Harvard Business Review, who was the force behind this evening's forum. He was the one who put the evening together, and I'd just like to express our thanks to him for doing that. We have approximately 20 minutes or so for discussion, and maybe I'll start here with this gentleman.
Yes, I'd like to ask the panel, according to the sources Ms. Wyman brought up, it's pretty clear that Gorbachev will not stop with merely an economic blockade or his usual threatening tactics. Are there plans for perhaps like a general strike or massive civil disobedience in case of an actual Soviet violent aggression against the independent republics? Anyone of the panel?
I'll try to answer. I can't tell you about any specific plans like civil disobedience. I think partly it could be counterproductive, but I think economic blockade can never be perfect under the modern circumstances. So I think especially Lithuanians and Estonians have something we could use as an answer to the Soviet blockade. We are exporting our electric energy to Leningrad area. The Soviet Union would require our dairy products, our meat, our potatoes, our commodity goods. So I doubt if it would make any sense for Moscow to implement economic blockade. The only thing we would need is gas and oil, and I think there are just now negotiations in process with Norwegian government, between Lithuanian representatives and Norwegian government to get supplies perhaps from Norway.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I would like to add maybe to that that 1/3 of all hard currency the Soviet Union is getting comes through the port of Ventspils, Latvia, because oil is exported through this port. So if there is anything to disrupt that flow, well, the Soviet Union will suffer terribly.
Thank you.
The Soviets have a long history of using the words that we cherish, such as democracy, liberty, and using them in perverse means to apply to themselves. And all three of the speakers today have alluded to this technique as continuing, such as calling the Supreme Soviets parliaments, calling these chairmen of the various committees presidents, alluding to the parallel between Mr. Gorbachev and Mr. Bush, that Mr. Bush has a Congress to deal with, Mr. Gorbachev has his Congress to deal with. Even Mr. Jones alluded to the vote in the People's Congress. Lowry Wyman talked about things that are not reported that happen in the Soviet Union, such as various laws that are passed that just aren't ignored. Why do you think this happens, that we allow the Soviets to set the terms of reference, to call Baltic issues internal affairs, to imply there's some connection or some analogy between the U.S. Civil War and what's currently taking place in the breakup of the Soviet Empire? And what can we do to remedy this situation? If all three of you would care to comment, I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Well, I, for one, don't understand why the distinctions are made. I think it has primarily to do with the fact that there is a great deal of disinformation that gets in our Western press, and in order for our press to say it presents all points of view, it ends up presenting points of view that don't get sufficiently repudiated. And all I can say with that is that every time an article appears that is way off the beam, you need to respond. You need to call and protest.
What worried me to some extent is obvious contradiction between the Western theoretical approach, the policy of non-recognizing the Baltic occupation and annexation, and as a result, non-recognizing also political structures created by the Soviet occupation authorities, and between the practical approach of, in fact, recognizing that there are now a sort of legal or more democratic parliaments existing in the Baltic area. I would say there's a long way to go to restore real parliamentary democracy. And in my opinion, what we badly need is just to have a real alternative, a genuine democratic alternative to the Soviet-style organs. That's what Estonians have started to do just now.
Well, maybe I would add to that there is an old tradition indeed of double talk and double think, which Orwell has brought out very well in his 1984, and this tradition is still continuing. Well, but I'd like also to add to that the Congress in Moscow that elected the so-called president Gorbachev is by 1/3 appointed by the same president, or bodies that are very close to him, like the Communist Party Central Committee, and the trade unions, which are also another edition of the Communist Party, and other organization of the kind. But I wouldn't. Well, of course, I'd also pay more attention to other elected bodies which appear now on the Soviet political scene. Of one of such bodies, I am myself a member, and that is the Supreme Soviet of Latvia. Well, elected, of course, under occupation, And yet, although these circumstances are not normal, these bodies, some of them, may be rather close to what, in the Western sense, would be a parliament. Of course, it is not a parliament in full sense, but it's some steps in that direction. I would also view in this light the City Council of Moscow, the City Council of Leningrad, which are also have a democratic majority. Just because the democratic process in these major towns of Russia has gone far enough to allow for this democratic majority. So these these bodies may be playing some kind of a role of intermediate bodies between complete dictatorship that we had and real democracy which we hope to have in future.
Thank you.
As Dr. Jones duly noted, today Moscow stopped oil to a refinery in Lithuania. From what I understood, though he didn't note it, it's the only refinery in Lithuania. Mr. Grigorjevs spoke about cooperation between Baltic republics. I'd be curious to know what both Estonia and Latvia are ready to do about it in case they stop gas in addition to oil, because it's a little more serious than in the United States, since most people cook on gas.
Well, I imagine there are there is some gas already stored in all three of the republics, but some got is produced in Estonia. I think there can be some cooperation there, but I don't think there are any other plans worked out. At least I don't know about them.
So,
I support the independence of the Baltic countries and U.S. recognition of that independence. The government of the United States at the current moment is not ready to do so. I'd like to ask the speakers for as long a list as possible of what steps, short of recognition of the independence of the Baltic countries, you would hope or recommend that the United States government take in the next few days or weeks.
Well, any support is welcome, of course, but we should, I think, have in mind that recognition of the governments is of paramount importance, because these governments actually, I think any kind of support is important, but these governments or maybe the movements that have produced these governments have been working on the presumption that the United States haven't recognized the incorporation of the Soviet of these three Baltic states by the Soviet Union. And now when this non-recognition doctrine has to be worked upon, the United States refrain from that action, which would be only logical and necessary. So this comes as a surprise.
I would like to add that what is needed just now is a very clear and strong stand by the United States administration as for its principles of the Baltic policy. That would mean repetition of the traditional US stand on the Baltic question. And in addition, a clear warning to Moscow that using force or economic blockade would very seriously impair economic relations developing between East and West. And also what is needed, in my opinion, is an open, perhaps not yet recognition, but acknowledgement of the new political structures, independent structures, which has been created in Baltic countries just now. In addition, what might be helpful could be some sort of upgrading of existing Baltic diplomatic missions in the United States. As you know, there are Latvian, Lithuanian and Estonian legations and consulates existing as embodying continuation of independent states. So what would be helpful is also exchange of parliamentary delegations between US Congress and Baltic countries, to include Baltic countries into US package of aid for Eastern Europe, and also to include Baltic questions into conventional armaments reduction talks. I think we have to, it would be very practical to have a link between evacuation or reduction of Soviet troops in Eastern European area, and also between start of evacuation of those troops from Baltic area. And also, of course, discussing Baltic independence question on the next European Security and Cooperation Conference, the second Helsinki Conference.
I would add that it should be a topic for the summit. That's a necessary part of the agenda for the summit, because if the United States is serious about helping to create the genuine possibility of the rule of law in the Soviet Union, the way the Soviet Union has been treating the Baltics doesn't bode well, and the condemnation of the acts that have taken place already needs to be made very clear to the Soviets, both in public and in private. I think there has to be something on the agenda that addresses the question of how you create good neighborly relations based on mutual agreement rather than force. The Soviet Union seems to be taking the position that Lithuania cannot be an equal partner, cannot enter into negotiations as an equal partner, a full state. It's something more than a question of the Soviet Union talking to another republic of the Soviet Union. It has to do with the way the Soviet Union treats people in negotiations, and I think this needs to be pointed out. There has to be somewhere down the line the creation of opportunities for rational economic ties between republics and between nations, and this is an opportunity for the United States to participate in the development of rational economic ties with the Baltic states and the creation of opportunities for the disentanglement of the Baltic states on an economic level. If the United States should wish to make a positive contribution, now is the time to do it, because it's going to come up in the context of the rest of the Soviet Union, perhaps much sooner than anyone would like.
We're supposed to finish at 9:30, but since there's clearly interest in the subject and the panel, maybe we could run over a little bit. Gentleman over here.
Well, I was interested to know what you think, what kind of support you could hope to get out of the Soviet Union, out of the people of the Soviet Union for your independence movement, particularly in the Russian republics. While I don't doubt the support for liberalization and democratization in the Soviet Union, and support for independence among places like Georgia and Moldavia and Armenia, how much and how large or how broad to the support do you think you can gain for Baltic independence in the great Russian republics, even among the more liberal elements in Russia? Or does great Russian nationalism tend to overshadow that?
Well, the problem with Russia is that the government of this country doesn't have to pay much attention to what the people of the country think. And this is the case we witness now. There have been major demonstrations in Leningrad and Moscow in support of Lithuanian independence under the motto "Hands off Lithuania." There was a mass also movement in support of Lithuanian independence in the Ukraine. Well, we receive, I mean, even in the paper I edit, receive letters and telegrams in support of Lithuanian independence. People's deputy, Yuri Afanasyev, one of well-known Russian liberal historians, is, I think, even currently in Vilnius, supporting the government, the Lithuanian government. Well, and he goes to the demonstrations were organized by conservative Russians, trying to persuade them that Lithuanian independence is in their interest and that they have to come to terms with the government of the country they live in. So there is this movement, and I think it is on the it is growing.
So, for instance, in a year or so, when there's possibly even more democratic forces in the country, in Russia, maybe after some elections, you hope to gain some support?
Yes, and I'm sure that we are going to get support from the councils of Moscow and Leningrad. The People's Congress of the Russian Federation is convening in mid-May, so we shall see what happens there.
Thank you. Gentleman on that.
Question on Lithuania. The moral, ethical, legal arguments, very cogent, unassailable, notwithstanding, was the step taken by Lithuania practical vis-a-vis Moscow? In other words, Laurie, when you were there, did you get a sense that perhaps Mr. Landsbergis took a giant step when he should have taken smaller steps? Was there a sense that if Brazauskas was in power, leading the country, that perhaps it may have been handled a little better?
I thought it was handled magnificently, so I guess I would start. I would start by saying that I couldn't imagine a more cohesive group run by a more dedicated and talented man than Vytautas Landsbergis. When I arrived, I didn't know what Mr. Landsbergis looked like, so I went into a room and witnessed conversations and tried to figure out who was who. And there was someone off to the side who seemed very special, and I wasn't sure who it was. He later came over to shake my hand, and I learned later that that was Mr. Landsbergis. This man has, to my limited experience, the makings of a very great leader. I have not had the opportunity in my lifetime to see other leaders of his greatness up front, except perhaps Andrei Dmitrievich Sakharov. But this man is that sort of person, the same caliber. He is able to bring people together. He's able to run a discussion so that all of the pros and cons of a particular issue are discussed and so that a consensus is reached. And he's even able to leave room for those people who very strongly oppose a particular view that he's adopting, room to disagree and then to proceed along with the majority. I think Lithuania is very lucky to have him, and the only reason that Brazauskas, in my view, was given the public acclaim that he was is that he indeed has a personality. He's very engaging. He is an accomplished politician, and he had the benefit of state television behind him all the way while he was moving as at the forefront of the independence movement.
Hi, my question is for Ms. Wyman.
Just would you like to?
To add to that, that small steps have led us nowhere. We've been trying to do that, and the time has come to present our case quite clearly. And Vytautas Landsbergis and the Lithuanian Supreme Council have done that. Well, I should also add that Gorbachev has, in the country, in the country he hasn't got that reputation, but outside his country he's got a reputation of a reformer and a liberal, having actually produced very little reform and I don't know whether any liberalism at all. Well, we have seen him being on television, being rude to Sakharov during the People's Congress. He'd hushed down the Armenian deputation at a discussion at the Supreme Soviet. Well, actually, he is behaving himself in these elected bodies or half-appointed bodies as a dictator, and he has now assumed these dictatorial powers.
Could I just add something? I just wanted to say that people don't seem to remember that the Zionist movement has been active for the past 2 years, and that the movement towards independence was always part of the Zionist platform, and there were statements in even the Western press more than a month before the declaration to restore independent statehood was made. So it wasn't something that was thought up at the last moment. Nothing of the sort. And the people who made that decision realized that they were making it with their lives, and they took it very seriously.
Thank you.
Hi, I'd like to play the devil's advocate a little bit. It seems as though a large portion of the American public views Gorbachev a lot differently from the way that I think we do. If you have polls in television and in newspapers where 60 to 70%, when posed the question of whether we should support Gorbachev and his perestroika movement or whether we should support Lithuania, 60 to 70% said that we should support Gorbachev because he's moving in the right direction and we shouldn't undermine him. What response or what argument would you give to convince these people?
This is what I've already started to speak to you about. Well, Gorbachev has tried to create the image of perestroika as a holy cow in India, something that is not to be touched. Yeah? But actually, there is very little, quite little perestroika in the Soviet Union. Yes, we have glasnost, which is far from actual freedom of speech, because we know what is going on in mass media now. At the time when Lithuania has announced restoration of its independence, it's actually disgusting to watch Soviet television now, because they would if there is a demonstration of a bunch of conservative retired officers protesting against Lithuanian independence, and maybe 3 blocks away there is a demonstration of 300,000 people in support of this independence. So we'd actually be watching for half an hour or an hour this the first demonstration and never hear anyone mention the other one.
Right, but the American people don't see the Soviet televisions. They only see what they see in America, and that's the problem.
Well, that's That's a problem indeed.
Yes, I would like to point out that this contradiction must be viewed as an artificial one, because the Baltic independence or real democracy and reforms in Russia won't exclude each other. And I think the major thing is to make clear for the Western public also has Mr. Gorbachev been up to restore genuine democracy, or has he acted as representative of Communist Party, having plans to maintain the Communist Party rule? I think we have had no conclusive proof that Gorbachev has had in mind real democratic reforms. And as we have said already, you can't have a genuine peace and stability without restoring democracy and freedom, and also justice. So the dilemma for the Soviet nationalities is that the Soviet Union is continuously prison of the nations, and that those nationalities have lost faith in the promises offered by good Tsar. So the danger to the world, if we consider it really, lies not in the collapse of the Soviet Empire, but rather in an attempt to sustain it. Because the longer it is artificially sustained by the West, the more violent its explosion would be.
I agree wholeheartedly with that, and I would say something in addition, and it's not sarcastic, that we need to teach geography in the schools, and we need to point out on the map where these countries are, because I think when the polls are made, people make a decision because they don't know where Latvia or Lithuania or Estonia are.
My question, I was going to ask you, anyway, there are some leading journalists have stated that if we push too hard in support of the Baltic states, that we will actually exacerbate this disintegration of the Soviet Union, and it could lead to civil war in the Baltic states. This was argued last night by Arnold Dvorchav at the Kennedy Library, and I would like to know if you could follow up on that.
Well, it is disintegration of the Soviet state or the Soviet Empire to be old-fashioned, but the Soviet Union is an old-fashioned state, so I think that it's quite appropriate to use this term. Disintegration and democratization are too closely knit. Actually, these are not two processes, but these are two aspects of the same process. So I think the more support the democratic movements gets, the more there is peace and stability, as my colleague has just said. So there will most probably be some kind of a civil conflict in the Soviet Union, but it's it depends on the Soviet Union and democratic movement, and on the outside world and their involvement in this crisis, whether it will the outcome will be for the Democrats, and whether there will be a peaceful dismantling of the empire or an explosion.
I'd like to ask the panel a question that looks optimistically beyond the current crisis. Assuming that the leadership in Western nations, including the United States, ceases its temporizing, and that there is a restoration of the independent governments in the Baltic states, and in view of the fact that the Baltic nations had a long pre-Soviet history of close economic and cultural ties to the West, is the best that can be hoped for some form of continued Soviet hegemony and something like Finlandization, or is there real independence in the works somewhere further down the line?
I would say Finland is not bad to start with.
projects are also discussed. Well, that is, some kind of an association with the European Common Market, some kind of an association with the Nordic Council and the Scandinavian countries. Well, and then maybe some kind of an area where the Western and Eastern interests would come together in trade and cooperation.
Since time is running on, maybe I could exercise the moderator's right to just say that maybe these two questions and then call it an evening.
My question might be a bit of the devil's advocate side, but how realistic is the view that the U.S. might be acting in defiance of international law and possibly breaking the UN Constitution if it was to support Lithuania right now in its efforts of secession? Ms. Wyman, you seem to have addressed it earlier in your
Yes, I don't understand. I'm sorry, I don't understand your question.
Seeing that international law
Yeah.
Prohibits other states from helping other states that try to succeed, is that a realistic view if the U.S. were to say that's its reasoning behind not helping Lithuania right now?
Yes, you see, I would say that on the contrary, it would be in accordance with the United States policies and international law to help to regain Baltic independence, because these countries are not part of the Soviet Union, so there's not interference in the internal affairs of the Soviet Union. On the contrary, I would say that it would bring such recognition, would bring the United States policies toward Baltic countries to its logical conclusion.
I would also add that after the Second World War, the Soviet Union was the only country that retained territory, occupied territory. The United States occupied Japan, the United States has left Japan. The United States occupied the Philippines. Maybe you don't think they've left the Philippines, but I think they've left the Philippines. France also withdrew. So the Soviet Union is the only country left which is still trying to hold on to the spoils of the Second World War. And the spoils of that war included all of Eastern Europe. And it's relinquished part of Eastern Europe, and now it must relinquish the rest of it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assuming that economic blockade is going to be an important weapon in the Soviet armory against the Baltic states in succession, what do you think, what would you recommend that practically the United States and the Western world in general, including Western Europe, should do to assist the Baltic states in escaping from that situation, if and when it should arise in a serious way?
I would say it is a very easy thing for the West to be done. I think the Soviet Union is in such a weak position that the slightest measure of economic pressure would be sufficient to exclude economic warfare against Lithuania or any other Baltic countries. The Soviet Union is so much dependent of its export of gas and oil that if the West would curb the Soviet exports of oil, we know that, for example, just reaffirmation of the International Energy Agency agreement from the year 1983 would be sufficient, because under the terms of this particular agreement it was agreed that Western European countries must not import more than 30% of its gas requirements from the Soviet Union. This agreement has not been followed. So if I think even a hint or threat to that direction would be sufficient to end the Soviet economic warfare against the Baltic countries?
Well, I want to be very practical. I think that, well, I'm absolutely sure that the Lithuanians, well, blockade or not blockade, would not give in and wouldn't go back on their decisions. And most probably they would have, well, even before the strong Western stance begins to bring fruit in the changing Soviet position. I think that Lithuanians will have to face all kinds of hardship. And I think, well, direct aid and direct help would also be welcome and necessary. I mean, even if it's some kind of emergency shipments of I don't know, goods, or it has to be considered what.
Is it the intercession of international organizations like the Red Cross and the United Nations? I heard President Landsbergis mention that he might ask the United Nations to call Lithuania a disaster area. I don't know the particulars of what that implies, but I think that makes a great deal of sense.
Well, the hour is getting late, and I would like to express my personal appreciation of the panel and offer my thanks also to the ARCO Forum and to you, the audience, for such a stimulating evening. Thank you very much.